Welcome. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining our webinar this afternoon, Navigating the Budget. My name is Veronica Garcia. I am the Executive Director of Houstonians for Great Public Schools, or Houston GPS. And we are on a mission to improve education outcomes for students in Houston by supporting school board leaders who commit to ensuring that there is a great public school in every neighborhood. And I have one such school board leader with me here today, Sue Deigaard. Hey, Sue, how's it going?
Going great. How are you?
I'm doing well. So Sue is an elected trustee. She represents a Houston ISD trustee. She represents District 5. Sue was first elected in 2017 to the HIC school board. She moved to Houston in 1987, so she didn't get started, wasn't born there, but got there as quickly as she could to attend Rice University. Sue is the first in her family to graduate from college, and so she understands firsthand the critical importance to a high-quality public education. And she also has two children who graduated from Houston ISD. So Sue, there is absolutely no one else that I would want to have with me today in walking us through the basics of a school budget and school finance. When we were first thinking about putting this together, you're the first person that came to mind. So I'm just thrilled to have you with us here today. Thank you for joining us.
Well, and thank you for having me. I'm excited for the conversation.
And so I think what I'm going to do is, this is such a complicated subject. So we have put some slides together to walk folks through. That'll help our conversations. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and put us into slideshow to help guide the conversation here. Just to kind of frame for everyone what we're going to be going over today. So I'm going to provide for y'all just a landscape of what is Houston ISD working with right now. What are the different critical factors that are impacting decisions that are being made? And then I'm going to kick it over to Sue to talk about how HIC receives money, how has HIC spent money historically, and then who controls the budget? And considering all these various landscape factors that are going on right now, what are the implications for next school year's budget? So without further ado, let's take a look at some of those factors that have great implications, not just for Houston ISD, but frankly for school districts all across the country right now. This is really a perfect storm that is all taking place at the same time, from the national level to the state to the local level. So at the national level, we have essentially the end of federal funding that the federal government allocated for purposes of COVID-19 pandemic relief. We also have at the state level, during the last legislative session, there was no additional funding that was appropriated for public schools for the basic allotment. School districts across the state, across the country, are actually facing a decline in student enrollment. And so Sue will go some into what does that mean for funding. And then also more specifically right now, as it relates to HISD, is there have been historical practices of inefficient spending. So just to double click on some of those now. So the end of pandemic relief. So the federal government allocated about $190 billion for emergency funding as a response to the pandemic, called ESSER. HISD alone received $1.25 billion in one-time funding. So over 4 years, they received just over $1 billion. They use these funds to pay for various different things, such as tutoring, teacher stipends, wraparound services, and even some employee salaries. And if y'all are interested more in terms of what all they spent as for funding, that is the link that will lead you all to HISD's website, where it lists out the full spending list. Now, these funds are set to end in September. And so what we're seeing are headlines from across the country talking about how many school districts are, have this looming fiscal cliff that is coming due to the end of these funds. Separately, last legislative session, there was no additional funding that was appropriated for public education. Essentially, that fell through when the legislature tied private school choice to additional state funding for public education. One did not get done. It made the public school funding fall through. And so there is no additional funds coming from the state at this time. And what we're seeing is just across our state, several districts, we see the headlines having to make some pretty significant budget cuts to deal with where they are at right now in their budgets. Also, something that is impacting districts across our region is the fact that for most school districts, student enrollment has declined. You'll see HISD is the fourth one from the bottom there. And so because funding is tied to student enrollment, that is also having a significant impact on our districts. And I think it's important to note that this funding decline actually started before COVID. And so this is something that's been happening for quite a few years now. And the last slide that I'll go over with you all is the fact that there historically have been some inefficient spending practices by Houston ISD. So in 2019, the elected school board did ask for the state's legislative budget board to conduct a performance review, essentially an audit of the district's spending. And the LBB found about 100 different areas in need of improvement, including many financial and operational inefficiencies. Earlier this year, the district administration released an internal efficiency report that detailed various ineffective financial practices that included excessive overtime payments, contract services, and transportation costs. So with all those four different factors at play, ESSER funding coming to an end, no additional state funding, a loss of student enrollment, and historically some inefficient spending practices. Sue, lead us through the rest of this discussion. What does this look like? Let's start with, how does HISD receive their money?
And I want to start out being abundantly clear that I'm looking backwards. I'm not looking forwards in these slides. This is how we have historically been doing things. And I just want to make sure that that is in context. So HISD mostly is self-funded. The majority of the money that we allocate every year comes from local tax dollars. There is some federal funding that we receive, like Title I funding. There is some state funding, even though, and we'll talk about this in a little bit, that some of our local revenue goes to the state through a process called recapture. There's still some other funds from the state that we get outside of that, but I don't want to go too far into that. I think what's most important to know here is that the majority of our revenue is from local tax dollars.
I think a lot of folks would find that surprising.
Yeah.
How about talk about these different buckets of funding?
Yeah, so I think this is really important because for folks to understand, there are three different funds that the board has authority over. And the board is really the fiscal agent for the district. The three big buckets, and you'll see this when the board votes on the budget, you'll see it anytime they're doing a budget, voting on budget amendments. There are three funds. There's general fund, debt services, and nutrition services. And I'm actually going to talk about them in reverse. Nutrition services is pretty much what the name says. It is our food service. It is federally funded. At least when I was an active board member, we did not, well, except for 1 year, spend any money out of general fund for nutrition services. You want that to be self-sufficient on those federal dollars. We have an absolute mastermind in the leadership of that area of the district who has continued to maintain that in a cost-effective way. That middle bucket, debt services, it kind of functions, if you think of, any of these like your household budget, kind of like your mortgage. It is for infrastructure. It is how we build new buildings. It's how we do renovations to buildings. It is how and part of it is used to provide repairs and maintenance to buildings, although we've run out of that because our last bond was, gosh, at this point over a decade ago. It is not debt from, all of our regular operations. It's its own fund. It's the bond. General fund is the budget that I would say it's how we do school. It's everything that happens inside that school building and to support the work inside the school building. It is all of our employees. It's all of the stuff we need to buy. It's transportation. It's, we're a large organization. There are people that need to manage payroll. Like, it pays for all that stuff.
So do you generally find that, the expenditures, should they stay in these buckets? So we've heard a lot about, for example, AC units that aren't working. Should the district be using general funds for purposes of
Well,
something?
they have to use general funds if there aren't any funds to use out of debt services. And usually what happens with a bond is after you've paid for those big things, there's usually some that gets you through to the next bond for big maintenance, ongoing maintenance things. Because if you don't have those resources in debt services to pay for those ongoing repairs and renovations, then they have to come out of general funds. And like I said, general funds is how we do school. It's how we educate children and how we operate all the things we have to do. And so just like nutrition services, if it isn't self-sufficient for its purpose, then you have to take money out of general funds to sustain it or to accomplish those same things.
Got it. So then we're taking funds out of the classroom.
Absolutely.
So tell us about, how does state fund HISD?
Well, as we talked about a couple slides ago, at this point, we are basically self-sufficient of local tax dollars, but the amount of tax dollars we get to keep is, and how really any district is given their tax dollars from the state, is through the foundation school program. And in its most simplistic form, it's the formula that you're sharing here on the screen. It's something we call basic allotment. $6,160 is the basic allotment. Like you said earlier, the last time that was increased is in 2019. That was half a decade ago. Inflation happens, so this is one of the arguments for why it needs to increase. It is multiplied by average daily attendance, ADA, we call it the ADA, average daily attendance. So it's the number of students times the attendance rate on snapshot date in October. So if a district has 1,000 students, but their attendance rate is 95%, their ADA is, if they have 1,000 students and their ADA would be 950. And then you would multiply that by 6160. Then there are weights. And this is one of the reasons why it's basic allotment and not a per student amount, because one student can actually be more than one unit or one student, because there are weights. The idea is the higher the student need, the more dollars that should be allocated to that student. And there are about a dozen different weights, including special ed, emergent bilingual, gifted and talented, compensatory education, economically disadvantaged. And a student can have more than one weight. They're cumulative. Refugee, homelessness. And then that is also multiplied into this formula. what is also good to know is there is a limit on how much money we're allowed to have for the state funding formula. We can, there are a couple of pennies, if you will, that is, we could increase our tax rate. This is by no means advocating for an increase in tax rate, but I do think it's important for people to know there is some money that we could tap into, but it is still limited. And it is also subject to recapture, which we'll talk about in a bit.
Is that the enrichment funding, Sue? Essentially, if a district chose to tax itself at a higher rate,
Correct.
that's called enrichment funding. Yeah. So how could we have excess funding? We always hear about district enough funding. What is this excess funding?
So in this wonderful formula, and we call it recapture. You've heard it called Robin Hood. And the question always is, why are we not suing to keep our money locally? That's already happened. The case has been tried. It was lost. So for now, this is the reality that we live in, whether or not we agree or not with the reality. And so there's something called the wealth equalization limit that a district has. It has to do with how much property wealth you have, how much revenue you can generate. And then anything in the formula also includes your enrollment. And then anything in excess of that, the district pays to the state. And I'm not looking at my notes. Oh, no, it's in your slide. It's about $250 million a year that we are giving of local tax dollars to the state of Texas to give to it's part of their funding stream to other districts.
Call it Robin Hood.
Yes, it's commonly called Robin Hood.
Have school districts ever tried to do anything about this?
There was a lawsuit a few years ago, and case has been tried. It's done. We lost.
Something that is unique about HISD is it may be considered property wealthy, but the student population is majority low income. Is that correct?
Yeah, about 80 some odd % of our students qualify for free and reduced lunch. If you look, in any of our horizons, we are a property rich district based on our property values. The weights in a couple slides ago, I talked about those weights for higher student need are supposed to be adjusting for the fact that a district like ours has a large high need student population. I would argue that part of the problem is none of those weights. First of all, we haven't increased basic allotment, but second of all, those weights haven't been evaluated or any adjustment made to those weights on what it actually costs to educate a student and educate, the differentiated needs of students.
Let's talk, how is HISD budgeting their money in terms of expenditures, or how have they historically?
Yeah, where does the money, we have this big pile of money. General fund is approximately $2.3 billion, not including us or not, where does all the money go? So a little over half of that is allocated directly to campus. And again, this is historical. This is looking backwards. Cannot articulate what's happening currently or what the plan is for next year, but this is looking backwards. But a little over half of the funding is allocated directly to campuses. About around the year 2000, give or take, HISD was one of the first districts in the country to what we call decentralize and go to a per pupil funding allocation system where we were giving the dollars directly to the principals. They are the leaders, the educational leaders that are closest to the students. Teachers are closest, but from a decision-making authority in a district, the principals are closest. There was a lot of training that happened for the principals. There was staff in the budget office to support principals in how to use their budgets effectively. There was supposed to be, and it's unclear if this ever really came to any kind of robust system of, what are the expectations of this autonomy that we're giving to principals, right? We're giving them all the money, we're telling them to go do school, but what were the expectations that were set and how was it monitored? And maybe at one point it was, but certainly I haven't seen that in the last decade plus. And also, I mean, this slide doesn't show longitudinal data, but there was a time when it was greater than 55%, and we've slowly been allocating fewer of our dollars to the campus. We've talked about recapture. I think what's important to see there is that's over 10% of our revenue is going to the state. These three buckets on the right are what people would think of as central office. And they're parsed out a little bit so you can see what some of these different things are. So campus supports are things that are directly benefiting the students on campuses. This is where our wraparound specialists were funded out of. I don't know if there's still teacher development specialists, that was something else, special ed, but it is dollars that maybe once upon a time would have been given to campuses to decide how to use them, but now are being decided by central office. These central departments, I would say, are operational types of things. Transportation, academics is on there, wouldn't that be, providing things to schools? Well, you also have other things that support academics, like the research office. HR, you have to have staff that are hiring people. You have to have payroll. We're the largest employer in the city. There are a lot of operational things that aren't directly related to educating students, but are inherent in a large organization, a large employer. And then district-wide services, keeping the lights on, the technology infrastructure, legal team, like just other things like that benefit the entire district. But I think the most important takeaways that I would say here, slightly more than half goes directly to campuses and over 10% goes to the state.
How are they spending?
All right. Same disclaimer. This is looking backwards. How we have historically, or at least for the past couple decades, allocated resources to schools was through something we call the PUA, the per unit allocation. Why is it called a per unit and not a per student? Some students are more than one unit because of these additional weights, very similar to the system that the district uses to allocate resources. And it's the same kind of math equation of this PUA. You can see her on the slide. There was some logic to having middle school a little higher at some point. That was before my time on the board. That number has been cut over the years and not increased. I think it is important to know that as well. We have slowly been dwindling the percentage of the budget to campuses. And it is also multiplied by the average daily attendance on that snapshot date in October. This is why it is attendance. There are two reasons why attendance is so incredibly important. The first, which should be the most obvious, if a kid isn't in school, they can't learn, right? Some of our schools that have been historically underperforming also have a high absenteeism rate. But the other reason for the importance of attendance is if our ADA is low, we get to retain less of our revenue in district. And for a campus, if their attendance is low, they receive fewer dollars through the funding formula. There are then additional buckets that we have historically given to schools, such as small school subsidies. So close to half of our schools, last I heard, qualified for a small school subsidy. It means that this per unit allocation system, multiplied by their ADA, was insufficient for them to even have the most basic things in their school. And when I'm talking about them, like, there are enough teachers. And so we have this small school subsidy. Now, some schools are small by design. That's a little different. The additional allotments are also magnet funding, which is also through a formula of how many students are participating in that program in a school, and different programs come with a different dollar amount. And then there's Title I, that is federal dollars that are allocated on that system. And then my understanding has always been that if a school has below a third of their students that qualify for Title I, that the school, however, does not receive Title I funds.
Did I
Yes,
hear
that's
you?
my understanding, but if I'm fact corrected, I will accept it.
Did I hear you correctly in that over half of the school campuses receive the small school subsidy?
There was, if you go back to some of the budget slides last year, there's something in there about how many of our schools got a small school subsidy.
I didn't realize it was that
It
many.
steadily increasing.
Wow.
Yes. Yes. And, nobody wants to talk about closing schools. That's never something we want for a community, but as enrollment continues to decline, we should be trying to attract families back to our district, but we do have a decline in live births. And what I think could be a really beautiful thing is if the district were to go to communities and say, what do you want what do you want school to be for your kids? This is what you're getting now. What do you want it to be? And especially if the district does a bond at some point, bring communities together that are in under-enrolled schools and say, let's all get together. And if you were to reimagine education for your children and you were to do it in this collaborative, community-focused way, and then we build you a new building to do that work in, I think there could be some really cool things that could come out of that. But that's never how districts approach right sizing. It's an aspiration, but
Well, Sue, we talked a little bit about how money is allocated to schools, to campuses. What about centrally? What do those expenses look like?
yeah, I mean, like I mentioned earlier, it's things that are, there are a lot of buckets here, but I mean, some of them are things that directly serve students on a campus, wrap around special ed, professional development of teachers, those district-wide things that we have to do operationally. But my understanding is that the NES system is all being centrally funded and not through the student allocation system. And there have also been historically, I think this is important to note, that this isn't the first time HISD has centrally allocated additional funds, like on top of the PUA or in lieu of the PUA, maybe not in lieu, but certainly in addition to the PUA system, to high need campuses. Prior to NES, we had RISE. Prior to RISE, we had Achieve 180. Prior to Achieve 180, we had Apollo 20. I think one of the differences might be is, and I would love to see a comparison of this, how many more students are receiving how many more additional dollars under NES compared to RISE and Achieve 180 and Apollo 20. Like, I would love someone to do a study of that. And then also compare, like add a bonus, compare outcome data.
So what about salaries?
Yeah, so the majority of the budget goes to salaries, and that includes benefits like insurance and TRS. There are going to be tough financial decisions. I want to interject here. I don't know if this is the right slide or not. We have, for years now, been passing deficit budgets. And when I say a deficit budget, the budget, this is how much revenue we have. This is how many expenditures we budget for. Interestingly enough, during the same period of time, our fund balance has grown. I have not quite been able to wrap my head around why that's been happening. Part of it, I think, has been conservative budgeting on the part of the administration. And I think another part of that has always been fallout. We fund positions, but there are always positions for a variety of reasons that are vacant at any given point in time. This person from the payroll department decides to retire. Well, now the position's vacant. It needs to be filled during that month or so. When that position's vacant, we're not paying anybody, right? So that becomes part of the fallout.
This was
We
the
made
slide. I'm sorry, go ahead, Sue.
we made a conscious decision last spring to not start to address this deficit and the impending financial cliff. And sorry, I'm probably at this point going a little off the slide. But we made a conscious decision because at the time the administration was going to cut small school subsidies, which would have had a disproportionate negative impact on high need students in small schools compared to large schools that might not have the same percentage of high need students. And the other part of the logic was, hey, if we're going to go through this huge change with a board of managers and a new superintendent, instead of us possibly cutting things that we shouldn't have been cutting and creating a bigger problem for them that way, let's just let them decide how all of these cuts are going to be made, which made their gap bigger this year than it otherwise would have been if we had made cuts last year. Like the administration was proposing central office cuts and campus-based cuts, then it was only going to be campus-based cuts, and then we just paused all of it. And to your slide about staff, what we call reduction in force or RIF this year, this slide I think is incredibly important. And this comes from the Edunomics Lab at Georgetown. And we are not the only district that their slide looks like this. If you go back a decade and follow the data, we have had a steady enrollment decline, and that enrollment decline started around COVID. It is not just kids who left us and didn't come back. It's, if you look at it disaggregated by grade level, we have fewer kids starting in those early grades in HISD. During that same period of time, we have had an increase, and it was, you can see this kind of peak that was before I was on the board. I can't quite explain it. Then this precipitous decline, but then still stayed higher as our student enrollment declined, and then is now taken this spike. And we knew, and if you go back and watch videos of board meetings when we got ESSER dollars and it was being allocated to hire new people, we knew that we were either going to have to find a way to fund those positions out of our regular general fund dollars, or those positions would have to be eliminated. In order to fund them out of our regular general fund dollars, it means you have to stop paying for something else. And so
There's a plan.
that's why cuts are going. I mean, that's part of why reduction in force is happening. And I have more to say on that, but I might wait till later.
Okay. Well, you mentioned fund balance earlier. What is the fund balance? Tell me more about that.
Yeah, so we also call the fund balance our rainy day fund. And like, remember how earlier general fund is how we do school. It's our annual revenue. I would describe that. That's like your salary that pays your bills. Debt service is like your bond. It's like, it's like a mortgage. The fund balance is your savings account. And we should be maintaining a minimum amount at all times for emergencies, right? We live in a place that, knock on wood, has not had still has had some catastrophic flooding. I mean, north of us, they're really struggling right now, right? And so we should keep money in this account for high need things, for emergencies. Another reason you might put things in you keep some money in a rainy day fund is, hey, there's some big expense we need to save up for that's going to take us a few years. You might put some money in your rainy day fund out of your budget each year for that. Most districts don't, because we're just trying to keep our heads above water from year to year. What's important to know here is because our fund balance has gotten so large, that is money that could have been invested in our classrooms during this period of time. I mean, it's ballooned up to about $1 billion. And if you think about our annual operating budget is just a little over $2 billion. That's a lot of money that we haven't been spending in classrooms. But once it's gone unless you have a plan for replenishing it. So you still cannot, you can use your rainy day fund to plug a hole, but it's temporary because the money is finite.
So who controls the budget?
Oh, this is a fun one. So the school board is the fiscal agent. I mean, that's why, in an elected system, they're called trustees. The board, however, doesn't choose how the money is actually spent. It really is supposed to be your superintendent, the person who is your administrative leader that is bringing to the board, here is how I think we should be allocating the money. Like, here are the goals that the district has. In a district like Houston that uses Lone Star governance as their governance model, they have goals. These are the things that we want students to know and be able to do. They have something called constraints. If these are the values that you cannot violate in pursuit of those goals. So the superintendent should bring to the board, here is your budget is your strategy, because we have districts have strategic plans. They're nice words on paper, but unless you have a plan for funding all of those strategies, it's just a nice thing. Really, your budget is your strategic plan. How are you allocating your resources to achieve these goals for your kids? And the superintendent should be bringing to the board, not just here's how much money we have, here's how much less money we have, or all the cuts, here's all the financial stuff. Here's the plan for accomplishing the goals with the dollars that we have. Here is the maximum impact towards those goals for these allocations. Here's the data that we're using to drive our budgetary recommendations to the board. And then the board should be asking, like, where's the evidence, right? In some ways, in a district like HISD, where they're progress monitoring these goals on a monthly basis, that's even an opportunity for sort of a mini budget conversation of, hey, here's an area where, we're doing this work and it's really working for kids. So we want to scale it. And this is what you're going to see in our next budget recommendation and how we're shifting funds. And then at the school level, at least in the non-NES campuses, the principals are deciding how to spend those dollars that have been allocated through that per unit allocation system, their magnet dollars or small school subsidies, and how they're doing that on the school level.
Tell me a little bit, you mentioned earlier, when HISD first became decentralized, essentially, the principals were allowed a lot of autonomy, but, was there any type of accountability that went along with that? I mean, what does that mean and what does that look like?
Yeah, I mean, it is, when that was established, that's before my time on the board, and even before my time that I was I didn't really kind of come into all of this until 2011. So I don't know if they had a system before that of principles. Here are the measurable objectives that we're going to hold you accountable to, student achievement data, operational objectives, financial expectations, what percentage of a campus budget is spent on instruction as opposed to, all the other things that, we do in school. In more recent years, based anecdotally on conversations I would have with principals, who would, anytime there was a budget, oh my gosh, we're losing this, we're losing this, we're losing this. And I'm like, well, we have a finite amount of money. Here's the question I have for you. What are the expectations that have been articulated to you by the administration that you're held accountable to? And usually it's, that's unclear. What I would lean into in absence of that would be our HB3 goals that schools were we created in 2020, 2021. Dr. Latham was still here when we did that work.
What are
And
HB3 goals, Sue?
so the legislature passed HB3 set in the 2019 legislative session, and every district had to have a goal for early literacy, early numeracy, and what we call CCMR, college career military readiness, post-secondary readiness. And so you had to have targets for all of your disaggregated student populations. And then every single campus also had to have targets for both their students in the aggregate and for their disaggregated student populations. And by that, I mean their special ed kids, their GT kids, their economically disadvantaged, different racial groups, and so forth.
And so those goals, you mentioned the budget should be tied.
Budget should be tied to those goals. And matter of fact, it is again, I know different people have different feelings about the Lone Star governance framework. It is what this board is using. It is something that seems to be what they're held accountable to, if you will, by TEA as appointed board members, the structure that they should operate in. And there is in that framework language about how the board should have an implementation plan from the superintendent, including a plan for campuses to achieve those goals. And that those goals should be the first priority for resources. And that's what really needs to be demonstrated before budget's approved.
And I think this slide here really just kind of gives a summary, right, of that HISD.
Hang on, I want to back up one step. The board has to approve. It doesn't mean rubber stamp. They need to, they need to have evidence from the superintendent that budget is aligned to achieve the goals. They are legally required to pass a budget by June 30th. If a budget does not pass by June 30th, then a school district goes into a kind of government shutdown. Like on July 1st, they can't pay their bills until they pass a budget.
These are critical conversations that are going to be happening. And Houston, like districts across the state and country, frankly, they're all facing a very similar challenge right now, given the loss of ESSER funding, the loss of enrollment, no additional state funding, past financial decisions. And so the district is going to be in a difficult position, and budget cuts are looming.
The district is in a difficult position. The district has been in a difficult position for a while. The two things that saved us from being in this place sooner, one was the infusion of funds in 2019 when the legislature increased basic allotment, which I can't emphasize enough, has not been increased in a half a decade. The ending of ESSER funding, of course, but the other saving grace that we had during the same period of time was we got those additional federal dollars. And this is not just HISD. Like I cannot think of any district I know that is not grappling with this fiscal cliff right now. We've been warned about it since the day we got the ESSER dollars that this cliff was coming, because so many of us plugged our deficits with these dollars and added things to our budget when we had these dollars.
And I think this here kind of goes over what you were talking about just a minute ago, about that the budget should align with those student outcome goals.
Yes. If you will indulge me, I came across something that I said 2 years ago in a budget meeting that somebody else tweeted out, and I saved and I've reposted it, I think every year. $2 billion of the public's dollars to serve nearly 200,000 children, and I don't, as a board member, see anything that gives me an understanding of how our goals are being used or what the strategy is for this budget. That is the number one important thing. The strategy shouldn't be just balance the budget, or we want to add these things and therefore we need to cut from over here. It should be a strategy that is aligned to achieve these 5-year goals within the constraints.
And what about the deficit, Sue? What about establishing a long-term plan to reduce it?
Um, I haven't seen one. There needs to be one. This is this graphic shows it. We have hit a cliff. If for us to keep running the district exactly as we have been running it for the past several years, we will run out of our fund balance. Absent more, we either have to increase revenue or we have to decrease our expenditures. The question becomes, how do we decrease those expenditures? And what are we gaining by any increases, any areas of increase, right? It means we're taking from somewhere else. What is the value add for what we're increasing compared to what we're losing by what we're decreasing? Mm-hmm. And that, I think, is another big question a board should ask an administration when they're not just cutting things, but if they're also increasing some things.
So I believe that the school board is going to have their first budget workshop on May 16th.
Yes.
I'm guessing you're going to be watching.
They're always my favorite meetings.
So what is it that you're going to be looking for during that meeting, during those conversations? What should we be keeping our eye on?
Yeah. So I have 3 big buckets and these are not just this year. Like, these are the things that I have been looking at since I started going to budget meetings as just a mom in 2011. And so the first one is that I keep calling it the big rock. Like, it's really easy for us to chase squirrels, to chase the things that have bad optics, that don't align with our values, to get distracted by things that are in a presentation. What matters absolutely the most is what I call the big rock question. What's the strategy? And not just the strategy of this year, but this year in context, or with the upcoming years. Here's where we're at. Here's what we're adding. Here's what we're taking away. Here's why. This is what the data is telling us. Here are the projections of what our revenue might be in the years ahead that might make us start to have to trim sooner. Here are the things that we might need to be scaling up over the next few years, and how that's going to impact future, or adding. Maybe we're not doing all the things at once. What is that really 30,000-foot macro level picture look like? That is if there is only one question that a board gets answered by their administration before they vote for a budget, it should be this one. And they should not vote for a budget if they don't have this question sufficiently answered. This is the question to start with before they get into all of the smaller ones. The second big bucket is the per pupil analysis. And here where I say per pupil, I'm actually talking about per kid. I'm not talking about a PUA, which is the mechanism by how we get money to schools, or basic allotment, which is the mechanism by which the state allocates to districts. I'm talking about how much money are we actually investing per student on a campus from all sources. And it's for HISD right now, we seem to be in this kind of hybrid model of NES schools seem to be more of a centrally allocated staffing and resource model, and the non-NES schools are still through this per pupil and magnet and so forth funding model. But what I would want to see is, and I would want to see it and compare, like, historically, And at the very least, so right now we're sitting in fiscal year 24. The budget that the board's going to be talking about next week is for fiscal year 25. I would want to see at the bare minimum by campus from all sources in general fund, how much we were spending per student in fiscal year 23, how much we're spending in fiscal year 24, and how much they're projecting or planning to spend in fiscal year 25. This in an additional note I want to make here. The board always, because we're legally required to vote on that budget by June 30th, the board usually votes on the budget in June. However, because of how all the planning for the next school year, and especially remember 60% of our money is in staff, how all of the staffing decisions get made, that happens in April and May. So from a practical standpoint, our administration, and this isn't, I'm not talking about just the current one, I'm talking about previous ones too, actually enact the budget before the board votes on it. Usually, there has been a vote on the resource allocation handbook before all of the decisions are finalized on campuses that are happening right now, that the board has approved, that increase or decrease in the PUA, that is, the board has approved changes to magnet funding or small schools, any of those kinds of allocations to campuses. I haven't seen that this year. And so absent knowing what the formula is, we really don't know what's happening on campuses. What I've heard, and this is, just from what I read, is they are not cutting any campuses more than 12%. But if your campus was already getting, was one of the lowest per capita funded schools in the district and has, is a Title I school, that 12% is a much, different impact than a large school. The converse, however, is a large school loses more dollars, right? Because they have more kids and they have more dollars. We haven't seen what this formula is for this year. And we've also heard, they're only ending hold harmless. And I think that's an important term for people to understand what that is. That when COVID hit and schools had a loss of enrollment, they had a loss of attendance. This is uniform throughout the district, throughout the state and country, that instead of only using the same formula based on our ADA, they used pre-COVID ADA numbers. The state stopped holding the district harmless. So we're now only getting our state revenue, our revenues are only based on our existing ADA, but we have still been funding schools with the pre-COVID ADAs, even though they have fewer kids. That's not financially sustainable to be allocating more dollars than you have, unless you're cutting from someplace else, and really unless you're creating a different formula. And I think the same holds true here of what are those weights? How are they allocating based on need? Is it the same kind of formula that was being used before with higher need, getting more dollars? Or is it just a flat per pupil amount that is not taking into account student need? And then this last bucket, and again, these are in my order of priority, is what does the flexibility for campuses that aren't an NES model look like? A lot of times what we do is, or the administration tells schools, because it's expedient, you have a vacant position, just don't fill that position. And I want to make note that I recognize these are human beings. These are people whose livelihoods are being impacted by these decisions. But if a school actually needed that position more than another position for achieving, to do school for their kids, if a school wants to decide to have a wraparound specialist instead of a front desk clerk, and they want to, staff the front desk differently, they should be able to have that autonomy to end that front desk clerk and keep a wraparound specialist. It really needs to be able to be done with a scalpel and not what we always do of these broad sweeping cuts and these expedient things that make numbers work on paper, but don't give us the most effective, instruction and operations on campus.
I think one of the illustrations that brought this point home for me was when we were talking earlier. You mentioned, one of the things that would keep you up at night is that student who needed only a couple more CTE or career tech classes in order to get a particular kind of certification, and the program ending.
Yeah.
The lack of some of this flexibility here that you're talking about.
I asked that question. I have multiple years, and they would get mad because it would be a series of probably 20 different questions that, like your example, how many students are going to lose a CTE program and not be able, a class for a CTE program would not be able to complete it. How many students currently have access, who are struggling readers, have access to a reading intervention specialist on their campus and are no longer going to have that? How many students, I could go on and on, but like specific things. I remember asking last year before, about magnet. And I said, how many students are going to have their magnet program end? And they're like, well, we're not cutting magnet funding. And I said, but not all of your the entirety of magnet programs do not just come from the magnet dollars allocated to a campus. Campuses also use some of their other funds to pay for that magnet program. And if central office doesn't actually understand how the schools operate in this decentralized system, they run the risk of unintended consequences to students. And that is a very big concern that I have this year, that I have also had in preceding years when we're not, and when it's just about making the numbers work.
Well, Sue, unsurprisingly, we are at an hour. That actually went pretty quick for me. I'm not sure about you. That was excellent. Thank you so much for taking what is a very, very complicated issue, breaking it down so that us regular folks, can understand. So I think, as we mentioned earlier, the school board is set to have their budget workshop on May 16th. We'd certainly encourage folks to tune into that and be on the lookout for those areas that Sue mentioned. Want to give a sincere, heartfelt thank you, Sue, for everything that you have done for Houston kids. You are one of the most committed and dedicated leaders that I know, even before you were elected as a school board member. You have been in this arena fighting for kids and public education for decades. And thank you. Thank you so much for all that you do. If y'all are interested in learning more about our organization, please check out our website, houstongps.org. Sign up for our newsletter. We follow the school board meetings and send out synopsis of what's going on at the Houston ISD School Board. And Sue, I'm sure we'll talk to you again soon. Thank you.
Thank you for the opportunity and for the conversation.
Bye.
All right. Bye.